Chris Regan had been living in Iron Mountain, Michigan, which is in the Upper Peninsula. He had recently decided with his son, Chris Regan Jr., to get out of the cold state and move somewhere else, get a fresh start. They had taken a trip to Asheville, North Carolina a few years prior and had a blast camping, hiking, and cycling. They officially started planning the move, which meant that Chris had to break up with his girlfriend, Terry O'Donnell. Chris eventually lined up a job in Asheville, and all he had to do was go into a lab for a drug test. As long as he passed, which everyone who knew him said he would, the job was his. But that drug test never happened. It was scheduled for October 15, 2014, but he never arrived. He and Terry were still friendly after the breakup, and the last time she had heard from him was on the 14th. His son, Chris Jr., texted him every day. Heck, they were planning a 1,000-mile or 1,600-kilometer move together and were in constant contact about it. He, too, had stopped hearing from his father on the 14th. There was no communication on the 15th, and he didn't arrive at work on the 16th. Despite being described as a sharp and responsible guy with plans for the future, Chris Regan had just vanished. This is Monsters. Kelly Gaboyan was born on June 5, 1982 in Hobart, Indiana. Her husband, Jason Cochran, was a neighbor, but since he was 4 years older, they didn't really hang out much when they were younger. They started dating after she graduated from high school, and a few years later they were married. Before that, she got into quite a bit of trouble. Her mother kicked her out of the house when she was 18 years old for continually showing up home drunk and high. Her mother, Melanie, worked as a customer service representative at Home Depot and had 2 other children to raise, so she implemented a policy of tough love with her oldest child. Kelly had already had a history of running away and living on the streets, so the situation was nothing new to her. It wasn't until Melanie's mother, Kelly's grandmother, died that she allowed her daughter to return home. By then, Kelly and Jason had gotten very serious, and he also moved in with them. Kelly would describe Jason as violent and controlling. She said he could only get sexual gratification by inflicting pain, so she allowed him to see other women to give herself a break. Now, there is a lot of information about Jason and Kelly's relationship that only comes from Kelly, so we have to take it with a grain of salt. They eventually moved into their own place in Indiana, and Kelly ended up with a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology with a minor in forensics from Purdue University. It seemed that things weren't going well in the relationship, though, since after 5 years of marriage, they separated. Kelly would go on to claim that Jason was abusive and regularly threatened to kill her. At some point, the couple got back together and decided to move out of the area. By then, Jason was out of work due to back problems, so Kelly found a job at an Ace hardware store in Iron River, Michigan, and the couple headed north. Kelly would claim they moved so Jason could grow marijuana to use for pain, as it was legal there. A detective from Indiana would later say that the couple had farmland there and could have easily grown enough pot for personal use without getting caught. He believed they had suddenly moved because they were running from something. They ended up buying a house in Caspian, the neighboring town south of Iron River. Kelly eventually landed a job at a military contractor called the Oldenburg Group. She was hired on as an electrical assembler, and it was there that she would end up meeting other men that she would have affairs with. One of those men was Chris Regan. Chris Regan grew up in Northville, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. He got married not long after he graduated high school, and he enlisted in the United States Air Force. In the service, he was a Cat 2 mountain bike racer. He also loved sailing and had developed a love of scuba diving after being stationed in Micronesia for 8 months. After having 2 sons, he spent as much time as he could with them outdoors. Chris Jr. described a lot of camping and mountain biking throughout his childhood. After leaving the Air Force, the couple got divorced and Chris reconnected with a friend from his past. While in the service, he had met Terry O'Donnell at a bar and the two became friends, but eventually drifted apart. After they met back up, sparks immediately flew and they began dating. But Terry was living in Iron River in the Upper Peninsula and Chris didn't like the long-distance relationship, so he relocated so they could be together. Due to his military background, he easily found a job for a government contractor as a supervisor and settled down. But it wasn't long before he became restless. In the spring of 2014, Chris Jr. had done some traveling, and when he returned to Michigan, he didn't have a place to live, so he stayed with his father. That was the time they decided to move somewhere warmer, where they could take advantage of more outside activities. They talked about Texas, too hot. Colorado, too cold. Then they remembered the trip they had taken to Asheville, North Carolina, and agreed that it would be the perfect spot. They had fun on their trip and decided it would be a great spot to get a fresh start. By mid-October, Chris Jr. had moved into his own apartment by then, and the two were packing up and getting ready to set off east to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Chris Sr. had found a job, and Chris Jr. had worked in cycling shops his whole life, so they didn't think he would have a hard time finding work. Asheville was known to be an attractive place for outdoor enthusiasts, and cycling was a popular pastime there. The pair were going to be traveling to North Carolina separately, and they made a deal. The last one there bought the other a steak dinner. By the 14th, they had also secured housing in Asheville, and after Chris Sr. completed his drug test, they would both be ready to make the journey east. That's when Chris Jr. stopped hearing from his father. At first, he thought maybe he was trying to get a jump on the trip, hoping to win that steak dinner. But as the days turned to weeks, it was evident that something was wrong. On October 27, 2014, Iron River Police Chief Laura Frizzo was headed to her vehicle at the end of a long day when she noticed a woman in the parking lot who looked concerned. Though she was eager to get home, her police instincts kicked in and she approached the woman and asked if she needed help. That was when Terry O'Donnell told her that she wanted to file a missing persons report. Back inside the police station, Chief Frizzo listened as Terry explained that her ex-boyfriend, Chris Regan, had been missing for 2 weeks. She explained that they had broken up, but were still on friendly terms and she had tried to contact him multiple times with no response. She said she had also found his car sitting in a nearby park-and-ride lot. She explained that the gray two-door 2013 Hyundai Genesis was very important to him and he would never park it in a parking lot and leave it like that. He also owned a 4x4 pickup which was still parked at his apartment. Those details helped get authorities to take the report seriously right away. Many times, authorities will shrug off a missing person report for a healthy adult as it's not illegal to disappear. It was odd, however, for an adult to go missing and not take either of their vehicles and not have spent any money as a check of Chris's bank accounts would soon reveal. Terry also explained that the last time Chris had been at work was on the 14th and he just never showed back up. She said that Chris was a very responsible person and would never miss work like that. Soon, Sergeant Cindy Barrett arrived for her night shift and the case was handed over to her. She sat with Terry, filling out a missing persons report and gathering more information. It turned out that Terry knew the owners of the apartment Chris had rented, so she arranged to get a key so she could check if he was there. She thought it was possible that he got hurt at home and she wanted to confirm. She went into the apartment and looked around, but he wasn't there. After that, she drove directly to the police station. When Sergeant Barrett was done with the missing persons report, she accompanied Terry to Chris's apartment. Inside, the place was disheveled. All of the cabinets were open and there were dirty dishes in the sink. There were also boxes that Chris had been using to pack for his move and a checklist of things to do on the table next to his laptop. One of Chris's medications was sitting on the stove in the kitchen and his other meds were in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom. They were important heart and blood pressure medications, something it was unlikely the man would leave behind. The calendar on the wall had the last day of work written on October 23rd. It looked as though he was planning to work another week past when he disappeared. Outside, the women looked at Chris's truck, a white Mazda pickup with a canopy and a kayak strapped to the top. Terry explained that he hadn't driven it for a while. He regularly switched his insurance back and forth between his two vehicles, driving the Genesis in the summer and the truck in the winter. After that, Sergeant Barrett met Terry at the park and ride to look at Chris's Hyundai. The doors were locked, and when she looked in the window, she could see 2 reusable water bottles and a knee brace. Terry explained that Chris had recently had knee surgery and still used the brace all the time. She also said that he rarely went anywhere without his water bottles. Terry asked the sergeant if she would pop the trunk, as she was worried that Chris might have been stuffed in there. Sergeant Barrett jimmied the door lock and popped the trunk from inside. Fortunately, there was no body in there, but it also meant they were no closer to answers. Inside the vehicle, the sergeant did find a post-it note that was sitting upside down on the passenger seat. When she picked it up and flipped it over, she saw the directions that had been written. It said, 424 left, stop sign left, through 4-way stop, left on side street to yield sign, left over creek right in alley, brown house. They were clearly directions somewhere, but that wasn't entirely unusual, so the sergeant collected the note and went back to the station. Though she didn't say it to Terry, that was the point at which Sergeant Barrett started considering that Chris might have gone into the woods near the park and ride and committed suicide. It was a theory that would bog down the investigation quite a bit. Fortunately for Chris's friends and family, both Chief Frizzo and Sergeant Barrett would not accept that as the final outcome. The Michigan State Police would be brought into the investigation and would not put their best foot forward in their effort to find out what happened to Chris. It would be said later that they phoned in suspect interviews and shrugged the case off as an adult who either chose to disappear or end their own life. The 2 women who had opened the case would quickly learn that those assumptions couldn't have been further from the truth, though. One of the details that Terry had given the police was that she had heard a rumor that Chris had been seeing a married woman. Chief Frizzo contacted the Human Resources Department at Oldenburg Group and asked if they had any information about Chris and if there was anybody he was close with at work. They told the chief that he had been seeing Kelly Cochran. About a month prior to Chris's disappearance, Kelly had been talking to her supervisor and dropped the bomb that her husband Jason had tried to kill her and then commit suicide. The supervisor called the police and they stopped by the Cochran residence for a welfare check. Chief Frizzo remembered that incident and that she had requested a sheriff's deputy go to the house and check out the situation. He had reported back that there was nobody home when he arrived, so he left a business card in the door and she called him the next day to say that she was fine. When the chief called the deputy to ask where they lived, he gave her directions to the Cochran house. Right after she hung up with the deputy, Sergeant Barrett called her with an update. She described the condition of the apartment and then she told her about the post-it note found in the Hyundai Genesis. After repeating the directions on the note, Chief Frizzo realized that they were the same directions she had just gotten from the deputy. It seemed that recently Chris Regan had gotten directions to Kelly Cochran's house and he went missing shortly after. It seemed like a pretty big coincidence. Frizzo told the sergeant to grab backup and go question Kelly. Once at the Cochran's house on Lawrence Street in Caspian, Jason answered the door and told the officers that Kelly wasn't home. Standing on the front porch with the door closed, he claimed she wouldn't be back for another hour. When Sergeant Barrett asked if anyone else was there, Jason said no. The sergeant noted that Jason was quite standoffish and clearly didn't want to give them any information. Suddenly, the door was pulled open and Kelly stepped outside. Barrett asked Jason why he lied and Kelly responded for him, saying he probably thought she was in trouble. The officers got straight to the point and explained that Chris Regan was missing and asked her when the last time she saw him was. She admitted that they had had a relationship and said that she had called and texted him on October 15th but didn't get an answer. Jason was still standing nearby, so Barrett asked if he knew about the affair, to which Kelly said, quote, he was okay with it. The sergeant told Kelly that they had found his car at the park and ride, and then Kelly said, quote, he loved that car. Barrett asked her to repeat what she said, and she did. She said, he loved that car. Sergeant Barrett made a mental note that Kelly had referred to Chris in the past tense. She didn't bring it up, though, and continued the questioning. She asked if Kelly had ever been to the park and ride, and she said no. Then Kelly said that she had just assumed that Chris had moved to North Carolina like planned. Barrett told Kelly to call if she thought of anything else and left the property. Then she called Chief Rizzo and told her she had a bad feeling about the couple. The following day, Chief Rizzo started making calls. She talked to his new employer in North Carolina and they confirmed that he had not shown up there. They said they had lost contact with him 2 weeks prior, just like everyone else. She talked to the lab that was supposed to conduct the urinalysis for his new employer and they said he never showed up. Then she spoke to Chris Jr., who said his father had never been depressed or suicidal. She also received surveillance footage of Chris getting fuel in his car at a gas station between the park and ride and the Cochrans' house at about 4 p.m. on October 14th. It was becoming more likely that the Cochran residence was the last place that Chris had been before he disappeared. Just to be safe, they had cadaver dogs search the woods near the park and ride just in case a body was out there, but they came back with nothing. On October 28th, both Kelly and Jason were asked to come to the police station for a formal interview and they both agreed. Kelly was interviewed first. She explained that she had met Chris at work and they just happened to hit it off. They would take breaks together and then eventually move to an intimate relationship. When she was asked if Jason knew about the relationship, she said he did and he was fine with it. She went on to explain that Jason had suffered from cancer previously and now he was unable to be physical without being in a lot of pain. Because of that, she dated other men and she was open with Jason about those relationships. In fact, Chris wasn't the only coworker she was having a romantic relationship with. She was also seeing a man named Eric Erickson, and all three men knew about each other. During her interview, she was adamant that Jason would never be jealous of the other men she was seeing, and he was absolutely fine with the arrangement. When Jason was interviewed, he immediately broke down in tears. When he was asked if he was okay with his wife seeing other men, he said he knew about it, but he wasn't happy. He explained that he had gotten sick in Indiana, and there was a period of about 18 months where he couldn't even walk. He said she stayed with him out of pity. He told the investigator that he wasn't enough of a man to be with Kelly, so he told her it was okay that she see other men. He knew about both Chris and Eric, but claimed that he hadn't met either man. When he was asked to take a polygraph, he declined and was eventually released. From there, Chief Rizzo interviewed Eric Erickson about his relationship with Kelly. Could he have gotten jealous of Chris and hurt him? Eric explained that Chris was his supervisor at work, but they didn't interact often. He said he met Kelly during a smoke break and they started dating soon after. Kelly had told him that she was divorcing her husband, which obviously was not true. When Eric found out through workplace gossip that Kelly was also seeing Chris, he confronted her about it. He said he wasn't interested in being involved as she was seeing other men. She told Eric that she had stopped seeing Chris a while before. Another lie. It turned out that Chris didn't believe her and he had been considering ending the relationship. One detail that stuck out from Eric's interview was that he said that Kelly would meet him at the park and ride lot and they would go out together from there. The same park and ride lot that Kelly said she had never been to. He showed the investigators the messages he had exchanged with Kelly about meeting up. Eric had texted Kelly saying, quote, "We could meet at the spot and go from there." The spot was the park and ride. Eric was very cooperative, even finding text messages on his phone for Frizzo, and he was more than willing to take a polygraph, which he passed. After that, he was excluded as a suspect. Chief Frizzo didn't think the state police had questioned Kelly and Jason properly. She felt they missed a lot of opportunities to question what they had said, and that's why they came to her believing the Cochrans weren't involved. On November 10th, Chief Frizzo personally went to the Cochran home and asked them to come back to the station for another round of questioning. Jason agreed to go first, so he went with Frizzo to the police station and Kelly agreed to drive herself to the station a little later. While the chief was questioning Jason, he started at the beginning and told her the entire history of his relationship with Kelly. It was evident that he was not okay with her seeing other men, and when he first started catching her texting other men, she told him they were just friends. He eventually relented because he believed he wasn't enough of a man for her, but he was never okay with it. He said that he had told Kelly that he wanted to kill himself, but claimed that he had never threatened her life. Then he talked about taking a walk and seeing Kelly's truck outside of an apartment in town and assuming it was Chris's place. Despite having to walk out of his way to get to that specific apartment, Jason maintained that he had never met Chris and didn't know where he lived before that. The police chief found it strange that Jason always talked about how weak he was and how he was in so much pain that he could barely get out of bed. But he was strong enough to walk 3 miles or almost 5 kilometers each way into town where he just happened to stumble upon Kelly's truck? It didn't sound right. When Kelly was questioned, she ended up going into much more detail about everything, which turned up quite a few contradictions. She had previously said that she had never been in Chris's truck and that he owned one kayak, but now she claimed that they took his truck to go hiking and kayaking and that they used 2 kayaks that were both owned by Chris. She also claimed that she told Jason everything about her relationship with Chris, though Jason had just told Chief Frizzo that they never talked about him. Kelly also gave more information about how Jason was violent and threatening. She claimed that he yelled at her and was controlling. She said that he had abused animals and that he had threatened other people. When Kelly was asked to take a polygraph, she also declined. After leaving the station, Kelly was finished cooperating and called the Michigan State Police to complain. She claimed that she was being harassed by Chief Frizzo. The state police approached Frizzo and told her she needed to back off. They were adamant that the Cochrans were not involved in Chris's disappearance, and they believed he chose to disappear or that he had killed himself. Their reasoning was that Chris was having financial trouble, but that was not true. Frizzo asked how they came to that conclusion since Chris was not behind on any bills. He had a full military pension and a full-time job. He was doing just fine financially. On top of that, Chris was excited about his new job and moving with his son. Since he was scheduled to take a drug test, he had done the extra legwork to get a note from his doctor explaining his recent knee surgery and that he had been prescribed Percocet. It was an extra step he hadn't needed to take in order to not lose the job if opioids were detected in his system. Why go to all that work if you're just going to run off? Chief Frizzo did not back off. She began looking for confirmation that Jason was really a violent person, but she couldn't. The only person who would say that was Kelly. At that time, nobody else had ever experienced aggression from Jason. His family said that he had grown up on a farm and that he loved animals. Nobody else had ever heard him be threatening. Frizzo started going through the text communications between Jason and Kelly, and it was clear that he was not aggressive. Kelly was the dominant one in the relationship. Anytime he would get jealous and question her extracurricular activities, she would tell him to shut up, and he would back down, even apologizing. He once wrote, quote, "You will continue to fuck me over, and I will continue to love you anyway." In the search history on his computer, he had searched, quote, "How to stop being a jealous husband." Kelly would later say that one of the real reasons that Jason wanted to move to Michigan was to get her away from her family so he could control her easier. But it seemed like it was really the other way around. With the Michigan State Police no longer willing to move forward, Chief Frizzo began working with some private investigators. She worked with Jim McNeil and Molly Barron from Delta Force Private Investigations, who didn't disclose who had hired them. She also worked with Mike Neeger, who had retired from the state police after working as a forensic specialist and had started a company called Michigan Backcountry Search and Rescue. He volunteered his time to assist law enforcement in difficult investigations. Mike accompanied Frizzo on a second search of Chris's apartment and car. Not long after that, the phone company sent the chief a text message thread that had been deleted from Kelly's phone. It was still in the company's records before the system was purged. That exchange happened on October 13th, and Kelly had recently returned from a trip to Indiana. The messages read, "Chris, sure wish I knew if you were okay or not. Please let me know, okay? I hope you are. Kelly, OMG, don't hate me, lost contacts. I did get you a gift on my trip. I was going to stop by your place but figured you wouldn't hear me knock. Chris, come over tonight. Got some juicy gossip to share. Kelly, is tomorrow better? Chris, I thought you fell off the earth. I would not have heard. I sleep sound now. Okay, how come? Kelly, I have been a bit sick and crabby, that's why. Chris: So, I am sick too. You could use a hug and some kind words. See you at 5. Kelly: I feel like my head is in a vice. Chris: Poor girl. Maybe you will feel a little better tomorrow. Sound better? Kelly: I'm hoping. This sucks. You okay? Chris: I'll survive. Glad to get the cold thing over. You better? Lucky you. Mine dragged on for a week almost. Drink liquids, take a multivitamin, eat food, and bundle up and watch television. The text message sounded a lot like Kelly was starting the process of luring Chris to her house the following day. You know, the day he went missing. Then Chris's phone activity showed something strange on the 14th. At just before 4 p.m., he had texted Kelly once with no response. Then, 14 minutes later, Jason texted Chris and he responded. Then Chris made a 7-minute phone call to Jason's phone. There was no more communication until 5:25 p.m. when Chris used his phone for the last time. Another text to Jason. That was the last time Chris made any outgoing communications, but his phone did receive a call at 8:57 p.m. the same day, and it was Kelly. It's believed that Kelly went to Indiana and retrieved a rifle, which Jason used to shoot Chris after she lured him to her house. After the murder, while cleaning up, Kelly couldn't find Chris's phone, so she called it to make it ring before hanging up. The phone company said the call only tried to connect for about 1 second. Another interesting detail about those cell phone communications was that they all bounced off a cell tower near the Cochrans' house, but Kelly had told investigators she was spending the evening with Chris at his apartment. It didn't add up. It was more than enough probable cause to get a search warrant for the Cochran house. In the middle of March of 2015, Chief Frizzo arrived at the Cochran house with a warrant in hand. Private investigators Jim McNeil and Molly Barron accompanied her along with other officers and the forensics team. Kelly and Jason went across the street to their neighbor's house to wait while the search was being conducted. When the investigators first arrived, Kelly had pointed to a loaded .22 caliber revolver in the living room under the entertainment center, and it was secured, but it was far from the only weapon in the house. They ended up finding dozens of weapons, mostly knives, swords, and other novelty weapons that Jason collected. Other than the .22, a single-shot shotgun was the only other firearm they found. Forensic technicians found blood spatter on the kitchen ceiling, but it had clearly been painted over. There was also a hole in the door to the kitchen, so the investigators theorized that Chris had come into the house, was hit with a baseball bat that was found by the front door, and when he tried to get away, he was shot while moving towards the kitchen door. Frizzo also noticed that the couch was positioned at a strange angle, and when she pushed it out of the way, there were bleach stains on the carpet. Though they only found the 2 firearms, they did find some .38 caliber ammunition that didn't match any weapon in the house. It was believed that the murder weapon had likely been dumped by then. It would later be learned that the ammunition was an off-brand that was the same type used in an unsolved homicide that happened near Hobart, Indiana 2 months before the Cochrans moved. A witness had described a white SUV leaving the scene of that crime, and the Cochrans drove a white Ford extended cab pickup, something that could easily look similar in the dark. Even though they found blood in the house, they couldn't arrest the Cochrans before the blood was tested. So when the search was over, the Cochrans returned home, but they didn't stay there. By the following morning, Jason and Kelly Cochran had taken off. The chief talked to the neighbors that the Cochrans had stayed with during the search, and they had even more details that were incriminating for the couple. The owner of the house, Carolyn Miatek, said that she had been woken up at night in the middle of October by what sounded like a gunshot. Then she heard someone screaming. A little later, she looked out the window and saw 2 vehicles leaving the Cochrans' house. Her grandson, David Saylor, would tell authorities that, in the days after that, he heard what sounded like construction work going on inside the house, something that wouldn't normally stand out if it hadn't been happening in the middle of the night. He said he heard saws, drills, and hammers, and when he asked the Cochrans what was going on, they said they were remodeling. He also said that the night their house was being searched, they were already at his grandmother's house when he arrived. He said they seemed extremely nervous and talked to each other about what investigators might find. Then David told a story about being invited to the Cochrans' house on October 16th to have dinner. It was 2 days after Chris went missing, and David said that the Cochrans had a lot of meat. He said it had to be a few $100s worth of meat. When they bit into the hamburgers, he and his other family members all thought there was something off about the meat. It had a weird texture, and it became a strong theory that the Cochrans might have dismembered Chris, butchered him, and ate the meat. The neighbors said that the Cochrans' dog gained a considerable amount of weight in the month following Chris's disappearance. There are a few other true crime stories where people claim the victim was eaten and, like in this case, there's never been proof. It's something that makes a story more outrageous, but we can only say it's a theory at this point. Hopefully that theory is wrong. A second search of the Cochrans' house revealed a notebook where Jason had outlined an idea for a book. It was called Where Monsters Hide. The main character was called Jason Quack Quack, and it detailed the character as being a predator. He wrote about the tingle a hunter gets when he's hunting his prey. The character worked for a traveling circus, and that's where he would search for victims. In the backyard, where an old burn pit had been, investigators collected any remaining ash. In the ash, they found a sawzall blade and the metal parts from a pair of jeans. Chris was wearing jeans when he was spotted on surveillance at the gas station right before he went to the Cochran house on October 14th. During that search, dogs were brought in and they hit on the spot where it was clear there had been a burn barrel. Then the dogs led the investigators down a path to an old mining pit called the Caspian Pit. It was now full of water and more like a lake. The dogs hid on the edge of the water, and eventually Frizzo got divers out there to search for evidence. In the water, the divers found an old metal barrel that had clearly been used as a burn barrel. Inside was a length of clothesline tied to a cinder block. Chief Frizzo had seen the same type of clothesline at one of the Cochrans' neighbors' house, and when she was questioned, she said that Jason and Kelly also had one, but it had recently disappeared. In the Cochrans' yard, there were several cinder blocks identical to the one in the barrel. Frizzo had also recovered videos from Kelly's phone that showed her and Jason hiking near a waterfall. Jason was jumping from rock to rock, having no difficulty in getting around. It was becoming clearer and clearer that Jason's back injury was nothing but a ruse. Around the same time, the analysis of the blood spatter was confirmed to be blood, but it was too contaminated with chemicals and paint to get a DNA profile. Jason and Kelly's location wasn't a secret for long because one of the private investigators, Jim McNeil, had put a tracking device on their truck. It wasn't something the police would have been able to do, but the private investigator was. When he told the chief about it, she filed for a warrant to get that information, which showed Jason and Kelly had left their house and stopped on Honeybee Road off of Highway 2 in Wisconsin, southeast of Iron River. They were there for about 8 minutes before continuing east to Hobart, Indiana. Chief Frizzo drove out to the location where they had stopped but couldn't find anything of interest. Due to the couple being in another jurisdiction, Frizzo called the Lake County Sheriff's Office in Indiana and the Hobart Police Department to ask for assistance. The chief was working on a warrant for both Jason and Kelly's DNA. Once the warrant was signed, Hobart Police picked the couple up and brought them to the station where they were shocked to see Police Chief Frizzo waiting for them. She spoke to Jason first and told him that she thought he was also a victim, and she asked him to help her put Kelly away. He refused to help, and he refused to answer any more questions. Officers took his DNA and photographs, and then it was Kelly's turn. Kelly was on the defensive. She had made multiple complaints of harassment and claimed that police had destroyed her house. Frizzo tried to get her to clear up some discrepancies in her story, but Kelly refused to answer any questions. Officers took her DNA and photos, and the couple were released. On February 20th, 2016, Hobart 911 received a call from Kelly Cochran saying that her husband was having trouble breathing. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they tried to resuscitate Jason, but they weren't able to and he died. The paramedics would later say that Kelly got in the way of them helping so much that they had to remove her from the room. When the autopsy was performed, they found a high level of heroin in Jason's system, but it was determined that he hadn't died of a drug overdose. Petechial hemorrhaging on his eyes and on his neck indicated suffocation, and it was clear that, though he had taken a large dose of heroin, he had actually died from suffocation to the face and neck. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. Detective Jeremy Ogden of the Hobart Police Department was assigned to the case, and he quickly interviewed Kelly, though he didn't tell her the death had been ruled a homicide. She claimed that they had both laid down to take a nap, and when she woke up, he wasn't snoring, so she tried to wake him up but couldn't. During that interview, Detective Ogden tried to get Kelly to talk about the details of Chris's death as a witness instead of a suspect. Ultimately, he was trying to indicate that Jason was guilty, and maybe, now that he was dead, she could finally explain what happened, but she wouldn't. The detective noted that she showed no emotion about her husband's sudden death. After the interview, Detective Ogden was trying to come up with his next move when he was put in contact with a man named Walt Ammerman. Walt was a good friend of Jason's, and he had concerns about his friend's death. He and the detective talked and came up with a plan to try and drive Kelly into a confession. Walt called Kelly and told her that Jason had sent him a letter back in December with an already addressed sealed envelope and a note that said to mail it to the Iron River Police if anything ever happened to him. He said not to open the envelope, just put it in the mail, so he didn't know what was inside. Kelly begged him not to send it, but she eventually said he needed to do whatever he thought was right. Of course, there was no letter, but that got Kelly nervous, and the following day she called Detective Ogden. Now, later she would say in an interview that she saw right through the ruse, but when she called the detective, she said, quote, "Things might be coming out really soon." She went on to tell him that Jason had written a letter for the Iron River Police, and it would explain what had happened to Chris Regan. She always tried to seem like she was smarter than everyone else, but it was clear that she had fallen right into their trap. Detective Ogden tried to get Kelly to drive up to Iron River to show him where Chris's remains were, but she refused. At that point, the detective kept an eye on her and eventually followed her to a lakeside park and saw her sitting on a fallen tree for a while. Then he noticed that she went back to that spot every few days, so he went out there and carved "Chris's here" into the tree bark. The next time Kelly went out to that spot, she saw the words, freaked out, and ran away. The detective knew that because he was watching her with a set of binoculars from the other side of the lake. It was another thing that Kelly would later deny in an effort to uphold her image. It was the same day that Kelly contacted Ogden and said she wanted to talk. Once they got to the police station, she claimed that she knew what happened to Chris, but she would only tell him if he told her how her husband had died. She had still not been given the results of the autopsy, so the detective told her that Jason had been shot up with a very large dose of heroin and then suffocated to death. He then reminded her that she was the only person in the room with him. She asked, quote, "So you think I murdered my husband?" To which the detective responded, quote, "I don't think, I know." She went on to say that Jason had shot Chris in the head and that he had died quickly. Of course, Kelly's initial story placed all the blame on Jason. She claimed that she had invited Chris over for dinner and that Jason wasn't supposed to be home. She went on to say that she and Chris were having sex near the back door when Jason appeared and shot Chris with his shotgun right as Chris had finished. She said that she and Chris both fell down the stairs into the basement, and after she got up, she tried to give Chris CPR, but it was too late. According to her, Jason went on to chop up the body with a sawzall. Now, this story is different from multiple other versions she had previously told. Of course, her first story was that she had gone to Chris's apartment, but evidence showed that that was not true. Once she realized she couldn't make that claim anymore, she told investigators that Chris had come over and they had sex upstairs in her bedroom. Now she claimed that they had had sex on the main floor near the back door, but it would change again after Detective Ogden transported her back to Iron River. Back in the Upper Peninsula, Kelly took investigators to a wooded area where she claimed they had dumped Chris's remains. While search teams worked, Detective Ogden took her back to her house in Caspian and asked her to recreate the events from when Chris was killed. At that point, she tried to tell the same story, but there were a lot of little differences. See, when you tell someone the truth more than once, the story is always the same because you're recalling what actually happened. Of course, people's memories can change a little over time, but it's pretty unlikely that any noticeable details will change within a day. When you tell a story that's a lie, the next time you tell it, you need to remember all the individual lies you've told, and you usually can't get them all right. So, in this version of her story, they had sex near the back door, and after they finished, they started walking up a few steps that led into the kitchen when Jason shot Chris in the back of the head. Then he fell backwards down the stairs. The problem was that there was a landing and a turn in the basement stairs, and it wasn't possible to shoot someone from the basement and hit them on the stairs going into the kitchen. When the detective asked what kind of gun Jason had used, she first said that it was either a shotgun or a rifle, but ended up settling on a rifle. She still said that she had fallen down the stairs with Chris, but she was unconscious for a few minutes after they landed. After that, she said she did nothing, no CPR. Once they were finished at the house, Detective Ogden drove them back to Hobart. Kelly was still not under arrest because they were really hoping they could get her to lead them to Chris's remains. Once back at the Hobart police station, she told the detective that Chris's remains were not at the place she had taken them that day. She gave Ogden a different location and was taken home. The following day, she sent the detective a text message basically saying goodbye. When Chief Frizzo found out that she had fled, again, she got an arrest warrant for the murder of Chris Regan. They got an emergency locate for her phone, and Ogden continued to text her throughout the day. She had her phone off, but he knew she would be curious about his response, and he was right. When she turned her phone on to check her messages, her location pinged in Wingo, Kentucky. It turned out that she had a cousin who lived there, and the local police quickly picked her up and placed her under arrest. Detective Ogden arrived in Kentucky the following morning and interviewed Kelly one more time. This time, though, it seemed like she had accepted defeat. She explained to the detective that, on the day she and Jason got married, they made a pact. The agreement was that if either of them cheated, they had to kill the person they had cheated with. If they weren't able to kill that person, the other spouse was allowed to kill them. She was supposed to be the one to kill Chris, but she couldn't do it, and instead of killing her, Jason decided to help her kill Chris. It's quite a convoluted story, and the detective asked why Eric Erickson wasn't killed as well. She claimed that Jason had planned to kill him, but she talked him out of it. After Kelly had been extradited back to Iron River, a cadaver dog handler just happened to call Chief Frizzo and let her know she would be in town for a few days. Frizzo felt like it was fate that the handler was in town, so she went to the jail to ask Kelly to help them find Chris. Kelly took them to a rural trail and pointed out where they had left the garbage bags that contained Chris's remains. They then sent the dog in, and she immediately hid on a tree, and under the dead leaves were a number of black garbage bags. Unfortunately, the bags were empty. They had been shredded, and it was clear that animals had gotten into them. As they continued to search the area, the dog ran into a field and hit on what looked like a rock. When Chief Frizzo went and took a closer look, it ended up being a skull. He would later be confirmed to belong to Chris Regan. Kelly also took them to a small lake and pointed out where they had disposed of the rifle that was used to kill Chris. On top of that, she took them back to the house in Caspian and pointed to a set of forceps in the kitchen that had never been noticed during the search. She claimed that Jason had forced her to use them to dig the bullet out of Chris's head, but she would later change her story and say she chose to do it so she could have some evidence against Jason just in case. Kelly Cochran pleaded not guilty, believing in her ability to manipulate the jury. Her defense was that Jason was the murderer and that she had only gone along because she was scared of him. The jury was not convinced, though, and on February 28, 2017, she was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aiding and abetting, larceny, conspiracy to commit dead bodies to disinterment and mutilation, concealing and abducting an individual, and lying to a peace officer during an investigation. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In April of 2018, Kelly pleaded guilty to the murder of Jason Cochran and was sentenced to an additional 65 years in prison. In 2018, while a documentary crew was filming about this case, they were at the location where the skull was found with former police chief Laura Frizzo when they stumbled upon another piece of Chris's remains. His lower jaw was sitting in the woods right next to where the group was standing. Laura called it in, and it was confirmed to belong to Chris. Kelly will remain locked up forever and Chris Regan got justice, but authorities believe Chris was not her or Jason's first murder. Chief Frizzo had a conversation with Kelly about the 14 butterfly tattoos she had, and Kelly talked about how they were a symbol of death. She had told Detective Ogden that each one was for a family member who had died, but she couldn't give the detective any names. The investigators believe that her tattoos represent each of her victims. In a recorded call with her mother from jail, she can be heard talking about having killed other people. She told her mother that there were other bodies in Michigan, Indiana, and Tennessee. People who knew the Cochrans came forward after the investigation, claiming they knew details of other victims, and one claimed that Jason offered to kill someone for him. It will probably never be known if there are really other victims, or if it's all an act so Kelly can get clout in prison. The one thing we know for sure is that the Cochrans were monsters, and they fortunately won't be a danger to society anymore. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.